The train groaned to a halt with a long, final sigh of steam and a shudder that ran through Joanna Hale's bones. For 3 days, that rhythm had been her only constant, the clatter of wheels on iron, the sway of the carriage, the fleeting glimpses of a world that grew flatter and emptier with every passing mile. Now, there was only silence, broken by the gruff call of the conductor shouting, "Dry Creek end of the line. Folks, Dry Creek." Joanna remained seated for a moment after the other few passengers had shuffled past, their faces weary and coated in the same fine dust that covered everything inside the car. She clutched the handle of her worn leather suitcase, its sides scuffed and its corners softened by journeys that had all, in one way or another, led to disappointment. Her knuckles were white. Outside the grimy window, the world was a study in brown and pale blue. The sky was immense, a vast, unforgiving canvas that seemed to press down on the handful of low, unpainted buildings huddled beside the tracks. This was Dry Creek, Wyoming, the place that was supposed to be different. In the pocket of her plain wool coat, her fingers found the folded edges of the letter. It was the 4th time she'd reached for it in the last hour. She didn't need to read the words. They were etched into her memory. A prayer she had recited in the dark of the rattling train car. Asterisk, we are a simple community. Miss Hale. Asterisk, Reverend Graham had written in a tidy, deliberate script. Asterisk, we value a sturdy character far more than delicate finery. There is good work to be done here for a woman of principle and fortitude. Asterisk. Fortitude. The word had resonated with her. It was a solid, dependable word. Much like the woman she tried to be, it suggested strength, endurance qualities she possessed in abundance. But the world, it seemed, had little use for fortitude in a woman who stood nearly 6 feet tall and spoke with a voice that was often mistaken for a man's over a low fence. She finally stood, her head brushing the curved ceiling of the carriage. It was a familiar feeling, this slight ducking and folding of herself to fit into spaces not made for her. She had been doing it her whole life. As she stepped down onto the splintered wood of the platform, the autumn wind hit her with a clean, sharp bite. It smelled of pine and cold earth and a deep, abiding emptiness. It swept the dust from the platform into little dancing spirals and whipped a loose strand of her brown hair across her face. The station was little more than a shed with a sagging roof. A lone station master, a man with a face like a dried apple, glanced up from his paperwork. His eyes, small and dark, took her in from the sensible boots on her feet to the top of her pinned-up hair. She saw the flicker of surprise, the slight widening of his gaze as he registered her height. It was always the first thing people saw. She met his stare without flinching, though the familiar heat of shame crept up her neck. She had promised herself she would not shrink here. Not this time. She forced her shoulders back, a conscious effort against a lifetime of instinctual slouching. With a firm nod that was more for herself than for him, she started towards the town's main street. It wasn't much of a street, just a wide, rutted track of dirt that stretched between 2 uneven rows of buildings. A general store, a saloon with swinging doors that creaked in the wind, a livery stable, and a handful of other structures that looked as if they were holding on against the vastness of the prairie by sheer force of will. There were few people about. A woman shaking a rug from a porch, 2 men leaning against a hitching post, a boy rolling a hoop down the boardwalk. But every head turned as she passed. Every pair of eyes followed her. She was an anomaly, a disruption in the quiet monotony of their day. A woman, alone, and of such a stature. She could almost hear their unspoken thoughts, the same ones that had followed her all her life. Asterisk, unnatural, awkward, too much of a woman. The memory of Thomas surfaced, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass. It wasn't his face she saw first, but the face of his mother, a woman as small and brittle as a dried leaf. She remembered standing in their parlor, feeling like a giant amidst the delicate furniture and porcelain dolls. Mrs. Gable's eyes had performed the same slow, insulting appraisal as the station master's, lingering on Joanna's large, capable hands as if they were grotesque deformities. A woman ought to be a comfort to a man's eye. "Joanna," she had said, her voice thin and reedy, a gentle thing. And Thomas, her dear Thomas, who had once sworn her voice was like warm honey and her height made him feel protected, had simply stood by the fireplace, unable to meet her gaze. He had cleared his throat and spoken to his polished shoes. "My family. We have a certain standing. People expect, well, it wouldn't be right. Joanna, not for you. Not for her." He had made it sound like a kindness, a mercy. He was releasing her from the burden of being his wife, of being his shame. The engagement was broken not with a shout, but with the quiet, devastating finality of a closing door. They had wanted a flower for their buttonhole, and she was a tall, sturdy oak. That was 6 months ago. 6 months of enduring the pitying glances in her hometown, the whispers that followed her from the church to the market. So she had answered the advertisement in a Boston newspaper. A reverend in a small Wyoming town sought a governess and assistant, a woman of strong moral character to help bring order and education to the frontier. She had written the letter with trembling hands, omitting any description of her physical self, pouring onto the page only the truth of her character, her skills in literacy and arithmetic, her patience, her desire for a place to be useful. Reverend Graham's reply had been her salvation. It was a lifeline thrown across a continent, and she had clung to it with all her might. Asterisk fortitude. Asterisk. He had seen that in her words alone. Surely, a man who valued such a quality would not be swayed by the mere vessel that contained it. Her suitcase felt heavier now, each step an act of defiance against the doubt that nipped at her heels. The wind was relentless, pressing her coat against her, outlining the strong, straight lines of her body for all to see. She focused on the small church at the far end of the street, its white paint peeling, a modest steeple pointing a hopeful finger toward the endless sky. That had to be his church. That was where her new life would begin. She imagined him meeting her at the door, a kind man with spectacles and a warm handshake. He would see her, of course, but he would see past the shell of her. He would see the woman he had corresponded with, the woman of principle he had invited into his community. He would welcome her, and the stares of the townspeople would soften, their judgment dissolving in the face of the Reverend's acceptance. She would have a home. She would have a purpose. She would finally belong somewhere. The hope was a fragile flame, and the cold wind of reality threatened to extinguish it with every gust. But she protected it, cupping her hands around it in the quietest corners of her heart. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles on the strength of this one single flame. She could not let it go out now. She reached the wooden boardwalk that ran in front of the church, her boots making a hollow, definitive sound on the planks. The building was even smaller up close, humble and weathered, a testament to faith in a place where faith was likely tested daily. She paused, setting her suitcase down beside her. Her hands were cold, and she rubbed them together, the worn fabric of her gloves doing little to warm them. This was it, the threshold, the moment between the woman she had been and the woman she hoped to become. She looked back down the street. The faces were still turned her way, small figures frozen in the pale autumn light, watching, waiting. She turned her back on them, on all of it, on Thomas and his mother and the years of feeling too large for the world. Taking a deep, steadying breath that filled her lungs with the clean, cold air of Wyoming, Joanna Hale raised her hand. She ignored its trembling and knocked on the door of her new life. The sound was louder than she expected in the profound quiet, a hopeful, solitary beat against the silence. The sound of her knocking echoed for a moment, and then was swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence. Joanna waited, her hand still raised, half expecting the door to be flung open with a hearty welcome and an apology for the delay. A full minute passed. The only movement was the dust skittering across the boardwalk and the restless swaying of a tall pine tree behind the church. The only sound was the incessant, lonely whisper of the wind. Hope, that fragile flame, began to sputter. She lowered her hand and knocked again, louder this time, the raps sharp and insistent. Asterisk, I am here. I have come all this way. Acknowledge me. Nothing. A cold knot of dread, chillingly familiar, began to form in the pit of her stomach. It was the same feeling she'd had in Thomas's parlor, the feeling of a verdict being delivered before the trial had even begun. She reached for the iron latch, her gloved fingers fumbling for a moment before closing around the cold metal. She pushed down. It gave way with a dull click. Hesitantly, she pushed the door inward. It swung open on groaning hinges, revealing not a welcoming reverend, but an empty, shadowed nave. The air inside was still and smelled of old wood, dust, and a faint, lingering scent of beeswax. Rows of simple, backless pews stood like silent witnesses, facing a plain wooden altar. Thin shafts of autumn sunlight pierced the tall, unadorned windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust in their beams. The place was hollow, devoid of life. It felt like a tomb. Her heart sank. Perhaps he was merely out, tending to a parishioner. Perhaps there was a simple explanation. She took a step inside, her boots echoing on the bare floorboards. As the door swung a little wider, she saw it. A single sheet of white paper, stark against the dark wood, was tacked to the inside of the door with a small, flat-headed nail. She already knew, before she read a single word. A profound and weary certainty settled over her. She had seen this letter before, in different forms, spoken in different voices, but the message was always the same. She was not wanted. Her feet felt leaden as she moved to face it. The handwriting was Reverend Graham's, the same tidy, deliberate script that had offered her a future. But the words themselves were not the words of a man of God offering sanctuary. They were the words of a coward, hiding behind ink and paper. Asterisk Miss Hale. It began with a formality that felt like a slap. Asterisk circumstances in Dry Creek have shifted since our correspondence. It has been made clear to me by my congregation that the needs of our community are delicate. The position requires a woman of a less conspicuous nature, one who might blend more seamlessly into the fabric of our town. It was an oversight on my part not to have considered this more fully. Asterisk Dry Creek has no need for any further spectacle. We are a quiet people. Asterisk, I trust a woman of your fortitude will understand. I pray you find your way elsewhere. Asterisk Reverend M. Graham. The paper trembled in her hand. Asterisk less conspicuous. Asterisk spectacle. Asterisk. The words were clinical, detached, but they struck her with the force of a physical blow. He had seen her. From a window. Perhaps. He had watched her walk down the street, had seen her height, had registered the turn of every head in her direction, and had made his judgment. He had weighed her character, her skills, and her earnest desire to serve against the sheer, inconvenient fact of her physical presence, and found her wanting. The promise of fortitude, once a compliment, was now an excuse, a convenient quality he assumed she possessed that would allow her to absorb this cruelty without complaint. He trusted she would understand. He trusted she would simply disappear. For a long moment, she couldn't move. The sunlight from the windows seemed to dim, the dust motes ceasing their dance. The church, which had moments before been her symbol of hope, now felt like the scene of a profound and personal desecration. The cold that had been a knot in her stomach spread through her veins, a creeping, numbing ice. She thought of the journey, the long, rattling days on the train, the meager savings spent on the ticket, the small, carefully packed trunk filled with her only belongings. All for this. A note tacked to a door. A bitter laugh threatened to bubble up from her chest, but she swallowed it down. It would be a raw, ugly sound, and this hollow place had heard enough ugliness for one day. She carefully unpinned the note from the door, the small nail resisting for a moment before coming free. She folded the paper twice, the creases sharp and angry, and tucked it deep into her coat pocket. A final, painful memento of a life that would never be. She turned and stepped back out into the sharp, bright light, pulling the heavy church door closed behind her. It latched with a soft, final thud. Her suitcase was where she had left it, a forlorn, solitary object on the boardwalk. She looked at it, and, for the first time, its weight seemed insurmountable. It held everything she owned, and yet it felt empty. And then she had to walk back. She picked up the handle, her knuckles aching from the cold and the tension. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and began the long, slow procession back down the town's main street. The performance of a lifetime. If the stairs had been curious before, they were different now. They were knowing. The station master was back on the platform, watching her openly. The two men who had been leaning against the hitching post now stood straight, their arms crossed, their expressions a mixture of pity and something that looked unnervingly like satisfaction. The woman on the porch had stopped shaking her rug and was now just holding it, her gaze fixed on Joanna. Every window seemed to hold a pair of eyes. She was a stage play, and they were all the audience. Asterisk, the tall woman's folly. She could feel their thoughts like stones pelting her back. Asterisk knew it. Too much for a place like this. What was she thinking served her right? She did not look at them. She fixed her gaze on the far end of the street, where the endless, dusty plain began. She focused on the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. The boardwalk ended, and her boots sank slightly into the soft dirt of the road. Each step was a small, quiet rebellion against the humiliation that threatened to consume her. She would not run. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating cloak. It was the shame of Thomas's rejection, magnified 100 times. That had been a private hurt, confined to a small, respectable parlor. This was public. This was a whole town bearing witness to her unsuitability, to her fundamental wrongness. The letter in her pocket felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric of her coat, a brand marking her as an outcast. Asterisk spectacle, asterisk. The word echoed in her mind. All her life she had tried to be small, to be quiet, to fold herself up and take up less space. But her own body had betrayed her. It announced her presence, drew the eye, invited comment, and here, in a place she had prayed would be her refuge. It had once again been her undoing. She was an outcast before she had even had a chance to speak a word. She had been tried, judged, and sentenced by a jury of strangers, all based on a single glance. Once again, she had been left behind, and no one cared. The promises in the letter had turned to ash in her mouth, mingling with the dust kicked up by her boots. The vast, open sky that had seemed so full of possibility just an hour ago now felt like a crushing weight, vast and empty and cold. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her walk had no destination. The street simply ended, bleeding into a wide, dusty expanse that eventually dissolved into the pale, sun-bleached grasses of the prairie. The last building to her right was the livery stable, a long, low structure of weathered gray timber. Its wide double doors were thrown open, revealing a shadowed interior from which the warm, earthy smells of hay, horse, and worn leather spilled out, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile scent of the church. The sounds were honest and real, the soft stamp of a hoof on packed earth, the swish of a tail, the gentle nicker of a horse in its stall. Joanna paid it little mind. She was simply moving, putting one foot in front of the other because the only other option was to stand still in the middle of the street and let the weight of her failure crush her into the dirt. She intended to walk right past the stable, past the edge of the town itself, and keep walking until her legs gave out or the vast, empty landscape simply swallowed her whole. She was nearly past the opening when a presence at the edge of her vision registered. A man was working in the strip of sunlight just outside the stable doors, bent over a saddler's horse. He was intent on his task, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate economy as he worked a tool over a piece of dark, oiled leather. He was a large man, his shoulders broad under a simple chambray shirt, its sleeves rolled to his forearms. As she drew level with him, he chose that moment to straighten up, stretching the muscles in his back, and Joanna stopped, not by choice, but by a sudden, involuntary halt, as if her boots had become fused to the ground. He was tall, taller than she was. It was a simple, physical fact, but it struck her with the force of a revelation. In her entire adult life, she had met only a handful of men who could look her in the eye without tilting their head back. This man would have to look down. The realization sent a strange, unfamiliar jolt through her, a sensation she couldn't immediately name. For the first time all day, she felt seen, but not scrutinized. He turned his head, and his eyes met hers. They were a clear, steady gray, the color of a winter sky, and they held her gaze without a flicker of surprise or judgment. He took in her height, the worn suitcase in her hand, the rigid line of her jaw, and the profound sadness she knew must be etched onto her face. He saw it all, but his expression remained placid, observant. He wasn't gawking at a spectacle. He was simply looking at another person who had appeared in his path. The utter neutrality of his gaze was more disarming than any insult. It stripped away her defenses because it presupposed she didn't need any. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated by the sigh of the wind. She should have moved on, nodded politely, and continued her miserable march into nowhere. But she remained rooted, held fast by that unwavering, unnerving calm. He spoke first, his voice a low baritone, a gravelly sound that seemed to fit the dusty landscape. It wasn't loud, but it carried easily in the quiet air. "Lost someone?" he asked. The question was plain, direct. It was not, she realized, an accusation or a judgment, but a simple observation. It was the question you asked a child who had wandered from their mother at a county fair. It was a question that offered help without demanding explanation. The raw, unvarnished honesty of it broke through the numb wall she had built around herself. The words came out of her before she could stop them, her own voice lower and huskier than usual with unshed tears. "I thought I'd found someone," she replied, the bitterness a sharp, metallic taste on her tongue. She expected a flicker of pity, perhaps an awkward shuffling of his feet, or a probing question she had no desire to answer. She received none of it. The man, this tall, quiet stranger, simply held her gaze for another long moment. His eyes seemed to absorb her answer, to understand the universe of pain contained in those 6 simple words. He didn't offer condolences or false comfort. He offered her something far more valuable, the dignity of his silence. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Then, his movement still unhurried, he reached up and untied the red cotton bandana knotted loosely around his neck. It was faded from the sun and sweat, softened by countless washings. He folded it once, neatly, and held it out to her. Joanna stared at his outstretched hand. It was large, the knuckles calloused, the fingernails clean but permanently rimmed with the grime of honest work, and in it lay the small square of red cloth. She looked from the bandana to his face, her expression a mask of confusion. "What for?" He gave a slight jerk of his chin towards her own hands. She looked down. She had been clutching the handle of her suitcase with such ferocity that her knuckles were bone white and streaked with dust. She hadn't even realized it. The gesture was so small, so practical, and yet so deeply perceptive. It nearly undid her. He hadn't commented on the tears she was holding back or the despair in her eyes. He had noticed her dirty hands. He had offered a solution to a problem she could actually fix. She hesitated. It felt impossibly intimate, to take something he wore against his skin, but to refuse felt like a rejection of the first and only kindness she had been shown all day. slowly, as if accepting a fragile truce. She reached out and took the cloth from his hand. Her fingers brushed against his, and his skin was warm and dry. The bandana was soft and smelled faintly of soap, sun, and him. She didn't wipe her hands. She couldn't. She simply clutched the soft fabric in her fist, its warmth a tiny anchor in the vast, cold sea of her despair. She curled her fingers around it, the material bunching in her palm. It was something real to hold on to. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate. He gave another small nod, accepting her thanks as simply as he had offered the cloth. Then, as if the transaction were complete, he turned back to the saddle on its stand, releasing her from the intensity of the moment. He picked up his tool and placed it against the leather, his focus returning entirely to his work. He did not watch her go. He did not ask her name, or where she was headed, or what trouble had found her. He had seen a person in distress, offered a small, tangible comfort, and then granted her the privacy to continue on her way. Joanna stood there for another second, the red bandana a secret warmth in her hand. Then she turned and began to walk again, away from the town. Past the last of the buildings, the direction was the same, out towards the empty prairie. But something had shifted. The crushing weight of her loneliness had not vanished, but it had eased, just enough for her to breathe. She walked on, with no destination and no plan, a rejected woman in a town that didn't want her, clutching a faded red bandana given to her by a man who was taller than she was. She walked until the last of the town's meager buildings was well behind her, the wide, dusty street dissolving into a pair of faint ruts in the dry grass. The prairie opened up before her, a vast, rolling sea of muted gold and brown under the enormous, empty sky. There was nothing out here, no shelter, no destination, just the sighing of the wind through the grass and the aching loneliness in her own heart. She stopped, setting her suitcase down. It was a foolish, theatrical gesture, to walk out into the wilderness, but the humiliation had been a fire at her back, and this was the only direction to run. She heard the footsteps behind her, slow and steady. Not hurried. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. There was only one person in Dry Creek who hadn't looked at her as if she were a blight on the landscape. She stood perfectly still, her back to him, and waited. He came to a stop a few feet away, the sound of his boots ceasing in the soft dirt. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply letting the prairie's silence hold them. "That's a long walk to nowhere," Colt Maddox said finally. His voice was just as she remembered it, low, calm, and stating a simple fact. "Nowhere seems to be the only place that'll have me," she answered, her own voice tight. "Maybe not," he said. Another pause. She could feel his gaze on her back, not pitying, but assessing. "I know a place. Might be you're needed there." She finally turned to face him. His height was still startling, a solid, unmovable presence against the endless horizon. His gray eyes were steady. He wasn't offering charity. It didn't feel like that. It felt like he was offering a solution to a practical problem, the same way he'd offered the bandana for her dusty hands. "Why?" she asked, the question sharp. "Why would you help me?" He considered this, his expression unchanging. Town gets to looking at a person a certain way. It's hard for them to see anything else. Seems a waste. He gave a slight nod toward her suitcase. "Pick that up. Come on." It wasn't a request. It was a quiet, firm instruction. And Joanna, weary to her very bones and with not a single alternative in the entire world, found herself obeying. She lifted the suitcase, its weight a familiar burden, and fell into step beside him as he turned and walked back toward the edge of town. They didn't walk down the main street. He led her along a path that skirted the town, a trail that wound behind the livery and the blacksmith shop. It led to a small, whitewashed cottage set back from the road, nestled in a grove of tall, whispering pine trees. It was the tidiest house she had seen yet, with a stone-lined walkway and the remnants of a summer garden, withered squash vines, and hardy, frost-touched marigolds clinging stubbornly to life. A deep, shaded porch ran along the front, a pair of wooden rocking chairs sitting empty. The place had an air of solitude, of quiet self-sufficiency. It felt like a world apart from the rest of Dry Creek. Colt didn't knock. He pushed the door open and called into the dim interior. "Aunt Agnes, it's me." He motioned for Joanna to follow him inside. The main room was small but meticulously clean, dominated by a large quilting frame and a cast-iron sewing machine. Bolts of fabric were stacked neatly on shelves, and baskets of thread and yarn formed colorful mountains in the corners. The air smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and hot tea. A woman emerged from a back room, wiping her hands on an apron. She was small and bird-like, her hair a wispy crown of silver, but her back was ramrod straight and her eyes were the same clear, piercing gray as her nephew's. They moved over Joanna with a swift, discerning sharpness that missed nothing, from her height to the exhaustion etched around her eyes and the suitcase she held. "Colt, you're tracking Dustin," she said, her voice dry as a leaf. "Who's this?" "This is Miss Joanna Hale," Colt said simply. "She's in need of a place. She can sew." Agnes Maddox's sharp eyes narrowed further. "Everyone can sew. Not everyone can see. My eyes are tired. Colt, not useless." She turned her full attention to Joanna. "Let me see your hands." Startled, Joanna hesitated for a moment before setting down her suitcase and holding out her hands. Palms up. Agnes took them in her own, which were surprisingly strong. Her fingers gnarled with arthritis, but her touch firm. She turned Joanna's hands over, examining the calluses on her fingers, the length of them, the neatness of her nails. "Good hands," she pronounced, as if evaluating livestock. "Strong, steady." She released them and pointed to a basket on a nearby table. It was heaped with scraps and mending. "There's a shirt in there, a linen shirt with a torn cuff. The thread needs to match the original weave. Find it." It was a test. Joanna understood immediately. This was her interview, and it would not be based on letters of recommendation or pleas for mercy. It would be based on competence alone, a flicker of her old self. The capable, meticulous woman she was before Thomas's rejection had hollowed her out, returned. She walked to the basket and sifted through the items until she found the shirt. The linen was fine, the tear clean but in an awkward place along the placket. She ran the fabric between her thumb and forefinger, then looked at the rows of thread spools on a nearby shelf. She scanned them once, twice, her eyes moving past the obvious whites and creams. Her gaze settled on a spool of pale ecru, the color of buttermilk. "This one," Joanna said, her voice clear and sure. "And you'll need a number 11 needle. Anything larger will pucker the weave." Agnes Maddox stared at her for a long, silent moment. A flicker of something not surprise, but respect crossed her face. She gave a single, sharp nod. "The back room is yours," she said, turning to her nephew. "You can put her suitcase in there for her. She'll earn her keep. I don't abide idleness." Colt did as he was told, disappearing into the back of the cottage with Joanna's luggage. Agnes pointed to a chair by the fire. "Sit. You look half-starved and fully frozen. There's stew on the stove." And just like that, it was settled. There was no discussion of pay, no talk of the past. It was a simple, practical arrangement. Her skill in exchange for shelter. Colt returned to the main room, gave Joanna a look that was both a question and a statement of confidence, and then saw himself out, closing the door softly behind him. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was as quiet and steady as a heartbeat. Agnes was a demanding taskmistress, her standards for stitching exacting, but the work was a balm to Joanna's soul. The focus required to execute a perfect buttonhole, or a seamless darn left little room for the painful memories to fester. Her hands were always busy, and in the quiet industry of the little cottage, her mind began to heal. They rarely spoke of anything beyond the work at hand. Agnes was not a woman for idle chatter. Yet, in the shared silence, a bond of mutual respect began to form. Agnes respected Joanna's skill, and Joanna respected Agnes's fierce, unyielding independence. Her favorite time of day was the late afternoon, when the sun slanted low through the pines, casting long shadows across the porch. She would bring a basket of mending out and sit in one of the rocking chairs. The rhythmic creak of the wood, a soothing counterpoint to the whisper of the wind in the trees. Here, on this porch, she felt safe. No one stared. No one judged. The town of Dry Creek, with its narrow eyes and narrow minds, felt a world away. She was hidden, sheltered by the pines and by the quiet dignity of the work she performed. She could finally breathe. The air was clean and cold, and she could draw it deep into her lungs without the familiar, suffocating tightness in her chest. For the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel the need to slouch, to make herself smaller. In the quiet solitude of Agnes Maddox's home, under the shade of the tall pines, Joanna Hale began to feel as if she might just have enough space to be herself. Colt Maddox was not a man who filled a silence. He was a man who inhabited it, comfortably, as if it were his native element. In the weeks that followed Joanna's arrival at the cottage, she learned the rhythms of his presence, which were as quiet and dependable as the rising of the sun. He never came to the door for a social call, never sat for a cup of tea, never engaged in the idle chatter that seemed to be the primary currency of Dry Creek. Colt appeared when there was a need, and he vanished when the need was met. His language was not words, but action. One morning, the autumn air had a new, sharp bite to it, and Agnes noted with a frown that the wood pile was nearly gone. Joanna, strong and willing, began hauling the last of the split logs from the stack to the porch, her arms aching with the effort, but her spirit resolute. She would not be a burden. Later that day, as she sat mending by the window, she saw him. He wasn't at the door. He was by the woodpile, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up, the axe in his hands rising and falling with a powerful, hypnotic grace. He never looked toward the house. He simply worked, splitting the fresh pine logs into perfect, manageable pieces. When she looked again an hour later, he was gone, but a tall, perfectly stacked cord of wood stood in his place, enough to last them through the first snows. Agnes simply peered over her spectacles and grunted. That boy. He anticipates a chill better than the birds do. Another time, the top step of the porch, worn by years of use, developed a dangerous wobble. Joanna, her mind on a complex stitch, nearly turned her ankle on it. She made a mental note to fix it, but the days were filled with sewing, and the task was forgotten. The next morning, as she stepped out onto the porch with a basket of linens to air, the step was firm beneath her foot. 2 new, shiny-headed nails were driven deep into the wood, securing the plank to its support. There was no sign of Colt, only the silent, sturdy evidence of his care. These quiet acts of service moved Joanna in a way that grand pronouncements of affection never could have. Thomas had courted her with poetry and promises, his words as sweet and flimsy as spun sugar. Colt Maddox offered her a solid porch step and a warm fire. There was no poetry in it, but there was a profound and abiding truth. His was a kindness that asked for nothing in return, not even the small coin of acknowledgement. It was simply given, as freely and as naturally as the rain falling from the sky. It built a foundation of trust in the silent spaces between his visits, a deep and certain knowledge that here was a man whose character was as solid and dependable as the timber he worked with. The inevitable day came when Agnes declared they would be attending Sunday service. "But," Joanna began, the protest dying on her lips as Agnes fixed her with a steely gaze. The church was the site of her deepest humiliation. Reverend Graham, the architect of her pain. The thought of facing that congregation made her feel physically ill. "But nothing," Agnes said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "You are living in this town, not hiding in my attic. They need to see you. Let them stare. A person's eyes will get tired of staring a lot faster than their tongue will get tired of wagging. Give them something plain and decent to look at." So she went. She wore her plainest dress, a dark gray wool, and tied her hair back in a severe bun, hoping to appear as small and unremarkable as possible. Walking down the main street beside Agnes's small, formidable figure was an ordeal. Conversations ceased as they passed. Heads turned. She could feel the weight of their collective gaze, the familiar burn of scrutiny. When they entered the church, the low murmur of voices died away into a sudden, complete silence. Every person in the room turned to watch them walk down the aisle. Joanna kept her eyes fixed on the simple cross at the front, her face a mask of strained neutrality. But inside, her heart was hammering against her ribs. And then she saw him. Colt was sitting in one of the rearmost pews, his long legs stretched out before him. He wasn't looking at her, but she felt his presence like a physical anchor in the stormy sea of her anxiety. As she and Agnes shuffled into a pew a few rows ahead of him, he met her eyes for a fleeting second and gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was nothing. It was everything. It was an acknowledgement that she was not alone in this. The service began. Reverend Graham, from his pulpit, avoided looking in her direction, his sermon on the virtues of humility ringing with a hollow, tinny hypocrisy that set Joanna's teeth on edge. She endured it, her hands clenched in her lap, her spirit retreating to the quiet, safe space of Agnes's cottage. Then came the final hymn. It was one she knew from her childhood, a simple, soaring melody that had always brought her comfort. Caught up in the familiar music, she forgot for a moment where she was. She forgot the staring eyes and the whispering tongues. She simply opened her mouth and sang. Her voice, a rich, clear alto, joined the thin sopranos of the other women. It was not a man's voice, but it was deep, resonant, and strong, easily carrying the harmony beneath the wavering melody. For a few beautiful bars, it was just the music. Then, she felt the shift in the room. The woman beside her faltered. A few rows ahead, a man turned his head to look back. The whispers started, quiet and venomous as snakes in the grass. "Lord have mercy" sounds like a baritone? Unnatural for a woman. The sound caught in Joanna's throat. The music died on her lips. The familiar, suffocating cloak of shame enveloped her, hot and complete. She shrank down in the pew, her face burning, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her whole. It was then that a child's voice, high and piercingly clear in the sudden quiet, piped up from the pew directly behind her. "Mama," the little boy said, his voice carrying to every corner of the small church. "Why does that lady sing like a man?" The world stopped. The child's mother gasped, a frantic hand trying to shush him, but the damage was done. The private insult had been made public. Every eye was now fixed on Joanna, some with pity, most with a kind of morbid, vindicated curiosity. This, their faces said, is the spectacle we were warned about. Reverend Graham stammered from the pulpit, his face flushed. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, and absolute. Into that terrible, humiliating void, another voice spoke, a voice that was low, calm, and resonant with an authority that had nothing to do with a pulpit. "Then, what do I sound like?" It was Colt. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved from his seat. He had simply asked a question, but the question was a thunderclap. It shattered the silence and the smug judgment of the congregation. It was a simple, irrefutable piece of logic. He, the embodiment of quiet, rugged masculinity, had a deep voice. If her deep voice was manly, what then was his? The question exposed the ridiculous, cruel absurdity of their prejudice, turning their own logic against them. A wave of stunned silence, different from the one before, swept through the church. This was the silence of shame. The mother quickly pulled her child close, her face crimson. People shuffled their feet and stared at their hymn books. No one dared to look at Colt, and no one dared to look at Joanna. Reverend Graham, flustered, quickly mumbled a benediction and dismissed the service. They walked home in silence. Joanna flanked by Agnes on one side and the quiet presence of Colt a few paces behind. No one mentioned what had happened. There was no need. When they reached the path to the cottage, Colt stopped. Joanna turned to face him, her heart too full for words. She wanted to thank him, to explain what his defense had meant to her, but she didn't know how. He simply looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers for a moment. He gave that same short nod he had given her in the church, a gesture that conveyed more than 100 words ever could. Then he turned and walked away, his long, steady strides eating up the distance down the road. Joanna watched him go, a strange and unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a profound sense of being seen, of being truly and completely understood. The shame still lingered, a faint and tender bruise, but it no longer felt like hers alone. He had stood beside her, in front of the entire town, and quietly, powerfully, taken his share of the weight. The rain began in the early afternoon, a soft, persistent drumming on the roof of the cottage that slowly deepened into a steady, gray downpour. It washed the dust from the pine needles, turning the air clean and sharp, and enclosed the small house in a curtain of whispering water. Joanna loved these rainy days. They blurred the edges of the world, softening the harsh lines of Dry Creek and making the warm, lamp-lit interior of the cottage feel like the only place on earth. She sat on the covered porch, a basket of mending beside her, the rhythmic rock of her chair a quiet counterpoint to the rain's steady beat. The porch was her sanctuary, a place where she could work and think, suspended between the wildness of the weather and the domestic peace of Agnes's home. She was restitching a seam on one of Agnes's aprons, her needle moving with the practiced, effortless grace that had become her signature. She saw him ride up through the downpour, a solitary figure on a dark horse, his hat pulled low against the sheeting rain. It was Colt. He didn't ride toward the house, but toward the small, sturdy barn where Agnes kept her milk cow. He dismounted, tied his horse's reins under the overhang, and disappeared inside. Joanna's needle paused for a moment. He came by most days, his presence a quiet, reassuring constant, but she hadn't expected him in this weather. A few minutes later, he re-emerged, carrying a heavy sack of feed over his shoulder. The barn door had been sticking, and he'd likely come to fix the hinge and check on the cow. After settling the animal, he came toward the house, but stopped at the edge of the porch. He was soaked through, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat and the sleeves of his heavy canvas work coat. He stood there for a moment, wringing the water from his hat. Then, with a grunt of effort, he shrugged out of the saturated coat. It was a well-worn garment, faded by the sun and softened by hard use, its seams bearing the marks of 100 repairs. He twisted the heavy fabric, a stream of water pouring onto the dark, damp earth. Instead of taking it with him, he shook it out once and hung it on a sturdy wooden peg near the door, a place where the wind would help it dry. With a brief, almost imperceptible nod in her direction that she barely caught, he turned and strode back to his horse, swinging up into the saddle and disappearing back into the gray, misty rain as quietly as he had arrived. Joanna sat for a long time, her sewing forgotten in her lap, her gaze fixed on the dripping coat. It was a profoundly male garment, broad in the shoulder and long in the sleeve, a shield against the elements. It seemed to embody him sturdy, uncomplaining, and utterly dependable. As her eyes traced its familiar lines, she saw it a long, jagged tear in the left forearm, running from the elbow nearly to the cuff. It looked fresh, likely from a snag on a barbed wire fence or a sharp branch. A decision formed in her mind, quiet and certain. He had mended their steps, chopped their wood, and defended her honor. He spoke in a language of deeds, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she must answer him in kind. This was a conversation she knew how to have. She waited until the sound of his horse's hooves had completely faded. Then she rose and went to the peg. She lifted the coat down. It was heavy with water and smelled of rain, wet canvas, and the faint, clean scent of the man himself. She carried it inside, the cool, damp fabric a tangible connection to him, and hung it on a hook by the hearth to dry. Agnes looked up from the quilt she was piecing, her sharp gray eyes missing nothing. "That nephew of mine would stand in a blizzard to fix a loose shingle," she remarked, her voice dry. "He has no sense of self-preservation." She watched as Joanna gently spread the torn sleeve, examining the damage. A knowing look softened the severe lines of her face. "He's a good man, but he's hard on his clothes." By evening, the coat was dry. Joanna took it to her small room, laid it out on her bed under the light of her oil lamp, and opened her sewing box. This would not be a simple patch. A patch was a temporary fix, a surrender to the damage. This tear required something more. It required restoration. She chose her thread with the care of an artist choosing a pigment, finding a heavy, waxed linen the exact shade of the faded canvas. She selected a needle that was fine but strong, one that could pierce the thick fabric without leaving a noticeable hole. And then she began to sew. Her hands, which had once felt too large and clumsy for a woman, moved with an exquisite, delicate precision. She didn't just pull the edges of the tear together, she rewove them, using a tiny, intricate herringbone stitch. She worked her needle back and forth, creating a seam that was not only nearly invisible, but was stronger than the original material around it. Each pass of the needle was a silent word of thanks. Each knot was a confirmation of his unspoken kindness. She sewed her respect for him into the very fabric of his coat, her gratitude laid down in a perfect, unwavering line of thread. The world outside the small circle of her lamplight ceased to exist. There was only the coat, the needle, and the quiet, focused rhythm of her work. When she was finished, hours later, she ran her fingers over the repair. It was smooth, flat, and immensely strong. She held the sleeve up to the light, turning it back and forth. As the outline had stated in her mind, it was as if the hole had never been there. A quiet, deep satisfaction filled her. She had taken something broken and made it whole again. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, she hung the coat back on its peg on the porch. It looked the same as it had before, just a simple work coat waiting for its owner. Colt arrived in the late afternoon, the sky now a crisp, clear blue. He came to fix the barn's sticky door hinge as she'd suspected. When his work was done, he walked to the porch. Joanna watched him from the front window, her heart giving a nervous flutter. He stopped and looked at the coat for a moment before taking it down. He immediately saw the sleeve. He paused, his thumb tracing the long, invisible seam. He ran it back and forth, feeling the strength of her stitches. His face was unreadable, his expression hidden by the shadow of his hat. He said nothing. He simply put the coat on, the fit familiar and right, settled it on his shoulders, and walked away. A pang of disappointment, swift and sharp, went through her. He hadn't said a word, but then, she reminded herself, that was his way, and it was hers. Their exchange had been completed in silence. But that evening, long after she and Agnes had finished their supper and the lamps were lit against the encroaching darkness, she heard the sound of a single horse outside. She looked up from her book, her brow furrowed. It was too late for a casual visitor. A moment later, a shadow fell across the front door. It was Colt. He was just standing there, on the porch, bathed in the warm yellow light spilling from the window. He wasn't doing a chore. He was just there. Joanna's breath caught. She put her book down, her hands suddenly unsteady. Agnes gave her a slight, knowing push of her head toward the door. Joanna rose and walked to the door, opening it to the cool night air. He stood before her, his hat in his hands. In his other hand, he held a small parcel, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. A delicious, warm, yeasty aroma wafted from it, the smell of fresh bread. He didn't smile. but the intensity in his gray eyes was more potent than any expression. He held the parcel out to her. "I owe you something," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet night. His words were simple, but they were layered with a depth of meaning that resonated through her entire being. He wasn't just repaying her for the mended coat. He was acknowledging her. He was seeing her skill, her care, and answering it in a currency they both understood. It was a debt of kindness, repaid in kind. She reached out and took the package. Her fingers brushed against his, and his hand was warm and calloused. The parcel itself was heavy and radiated a comforting heat. She looked from the bread in her hands to his face, unable to form a reply. For the first time since she had met him, a long, deep, and unspoken conversation had finally been given a voice, and it had been worth the wait. The annual Harvest Festival was the one night of the year when the hard-working, tight-lipped people of Dry Creek allowed themselves a measure of unrestrained joy. The largest barn at the edge of town was swept clean of hay and dust, its rafters hung with strings of lanterns and dried corn, its floor resounding with the stomp of boots and the lively music of a fiddle. The air was thick with the scent of spiced cider, roasting meat, and the sweet promise of winter apples. It was a celebration of community, a defiant spark of warmth and light against the coming cold and dark. For Joanna, it was a tribunal. "We're going," Agnes had announced 2 days prior, in a tone that brokered no argument. "You've mended half the town's Sunday best. It's time you saw it in use. Besides," she'd added, a shrewd glint in her eye, "there's no better way to take a town's measure than to see how they dance." And so, Joanna found herself standing against the rough-hewn wall of the barn, a mug of lukewarm cider held in a white-knuckled grip. She wore a simple dress of dark green wool they had made together. It was unadorned, but it fit her well, the deep color complementing her dark hair and the straight, clean lines of the cut acknowledging her height rather than trying to diminish it. Over it, she wore a heavy, dark shawl, her armor for the evening. It was a shield she could pull tighter around her shoulders whenever the stares of the townspeople became too much to bear. She felt like a tall, unmovable pine tree in a field of swaying daisies. The floor was a whirl of color and movement. Young women, their faces flushed and their calico skirts flying, were spun and twirled by strapping young men in clean shirts. Laughter rang through the rafters, bright and effortless. It was a world she could observe but never enter. No one asked her to dance. The young men, bold with cider and festive spirit, would let their eyes roam the room, but their gazes would slide right over Joanna, or worse, meet hers for a brief, startled second before skittering away. She was too tall, too quiet, too much. Agnes, a small, formidable anchor by her side, occasionally exchanged sharp, witty remarks with other older women. But Joanna remained an island of solitude in the sea of celebration. She watched, her face a carefully composed mask of polite interest. But inside, the old, familiar ache of exclusion was a dull, constant throb. This was where her deficiencies were most starkly displayed. She was not a woman to be desired, to be swept into the joyous, dizzying circle of a dance. She was a woman to be observed from a safe distance. She pulled the shawl tighter. It was nearly an hour into the festivities when the crowd by the large barn doors parted slightly. Colt Maddox stepped inside. He didn't blend into the scene. He was a piece of the vast, quiet wilderness brought indoors, his presence a stark contrast to the noisy, frantic energy of the dance. He wore a clean, dark shirt and trousers, but he still looked more at home under an open sky than under the lantern-lit rafters. He stood for a moment, his steady gray eyes sweeping the room, his expression unreadable. Joanna's heart gave a sudden, sharp jolt, a foolish, hopeful leap that she immediately tried to suppress. His gaze passed over the dancers, over the tables laden with food, over the gossiping matrons, and then it found her. Across the entire expanse of the bustling room, his eyes met hers and held The noise of the fiddle and the laughter seemed to fade into a distant hum. In that single, sustained look, a silent conversation took place, a recognition that transcended the space between them. Then, with a purpose that was both unnerving and thrilling, he began to walk toward her. He did not meander through the crowd. He moved directly, a straight, unwavering line, and the dancers and onlookers seemed to part for him as if by instinct. A hush fell over the people nearest to them. The whispers began. Joanna's face burned. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the rough wood of the wall behind her, but his eyes held her pinned, a willing captive. He stopped in front of her. The fiddler, perhaps sensing a moment of drama, drew his bow across the strings in the opening notes of a slow, beautiful waltz. Colt didn't speak. He didn't ask, "May I have this dance?" He didn't give her the chance to stammer a refusal, to retreat behind her wall of fear and past hurts. He simply, and with a grave sort of courtesy, held out his hand. It was a command, a question, and a plea all in one. His eyes never left hers, and in their clear, gray depths, she saw no pity, no charity. She saw only a calm, unwavering certainty. He was not asking her to dance. He was claiming her. Time seemed to slow. Her mind screamed at her to say no, to wrap her shawl tighter and shake her head, to not make herself the center of this spectacle. But her heart, starved for a single, simple act of acceptance, betrayed her. Slowly, as if in a dream, she placed her trembling hand in his. His hand was large, warm, and calloused, and it closed around hers with a gentle, reassuring strength. He led her onto the dance floor. A collective, audible gasp went through the room. Joanna could feel 100 pairs of eyes on them, but for the first time, she didn't care. He pulled her gently into the formal posture of the waltz, his other hand resting firmly on the small of her back, and they began to move. He was not a fancy dancer, but he was strong and sure-footed, guiding her with a quiet, confident pressure that she could trust completely. And for the first time in her life, she was dancing with a partner who fit her. His head was level with hers. Her hand rested comfortably on his broad shoulder. She didn't have to hunch or make herself smaller. They moved as one, two tall, solitary figures who, together, created a startling, unexpected grace. They didn't speak. There was no need. The steady rhythm of the waltz, the solid presence of him, the silent, stunned faces of the townspeople, it was all the communication she needed. He was, in this very public, very deliberate act, declaring his allegiance. He was standing with her, and in doing so, he was silencing the whispers more effectively than he had in the church. He was showing them not an oddity, but a partnership. When the last note of the waltz faded into the air, the spell was broken. The noise and the weight of the stairs rushed back in. Before she could retreat into herself, Colt kept a firm hand on her arm and led her away from the dance floor, through the crowd, and out a side door into the cold, clear night. They stood on a small, empty loading porch. The wind was sharp and cold. A sudden shock after the heat of the barn. It whipped a loose strand of her hair across her face and made her shiver. The moon was high and bright, silvering the edges of the clouds. The music from inside was a muffled, distant beat. Joanna pulled her shawl tightly around her, her armor once again. Her heart was a wild, frantic bird in her chest. That single dance had undone her, breaking down all the careful walls she had built around herself. She had to know. She had to understand. This was more than kindness. This was more than a gesture. This was a claim, and she needed to know its terms. She turned to face him in the moonlight, her voice a whisper, nearly stolen by the wind. "What do you want?" she asked. The question raw with a lifetime of being misunderstood, of being too much and not enough. "From me." Colt didn't look away. He didn't hesitate. The moonlight carved his face into stark, handsome lines. His gray eyes, serious and unwavering, held hers. "You," he said, The word was quiet, a low rumble that was almost part of the night itself, but it landed with the force of a thunderclap. Not your help, not your sewing, not your friendship. Asterisk you, asterisk. A shudder went through Joanna, a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the shattering of a long and bitter frost that had encased her heart for years. He wanted her, the whole of her, the tall, the strong, the awkward, the deep-voiced woman that no one else had ever truly seen, let alone wanted. And Joanna, who had spent a lifetime covering herself, hiding her light, and shielding her heart, did the bravest thing she had ever done. She let the shawl fall from her shoulders. It pooled in a dark circle of wool at her feet, leaving her standing before him in the cold moonlight, her defenses gone, her heart finally, terrifyingly, open. The morning after the harvest festival, the world felt new and dangerously bright. When Joanna stepped onto the porch, the air was so crisp and cold it was like drinking from a mountain stream. Everything the sharp silhouette of the pines against the pale blue sky, the rusty gold of the last autumn leaves, the solid feel of the wooden boards beneath her feet seemed more vivid, more real. The memory of Colt's single, devastating word, asterisk you, asterisk had recolored her entire existence. The feeling of her shawl falling to the ground had not been one of nakedness, but of liberation. For the first time, she felt not like a woman hiding, but a woman seen. This fragile new peace, however, was a thin layer of ice over a deep and turbulent river. Dry Creek was a small town, and a small town abhors a vacuum. The spectacle of the tall, silent cowboy dancing with the even taller, solitary seamstress had created a story, and the townspeople were eager to write its chapters themselves. The whispers began as a subtle shift in the social climate. When Joanna walked to the general store for supplies, the usual low hum of conversation would falter and die as she entered, replaced by a thick, watchful silence. Women who had previously offered a civil nod now found something fascinating to study on a high shelf. Their backs turned to her. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, who had once been pleasantly talkative, now conducted their transactions in clipped, monosyllabic sentences, her eyes fixed on the countertop as if Joanna's face might offend her. Joanna, who had spent a lifetime learning to read the nuances of disapproval, understood perfectly. She was once again a subject of discussion, an object of scorn. She did not need to press her ear to a door to know the words being used. She could feel them in the air, could see them in the tightened lips and averted gazes. She heard the first clear, cruel fragment as she was leaving the store. A woman's sharp whisper to her friend, not quite quiet enough. The woman who talks like a man, now with that wandering cowboy. It's no wonder. Misfits find each other. I suppose. The words were a physical blow, striking the tender, hopeful place in her heart. She kept walking, her back straight, her expression unchanged. To react was to give them power. To let them see her pain was to confirm their victory. She had learned this lesson long ago, in another town, with another man. She would not make that mistake again. The narrative the town was weaving grew more elaborate with each passing day. Agnes, whose ears missed nothing, would return from her own brief forays into town with a grim set to her jaw. "They're saying you're a predator," she announced one afternoon. Not with malice, but with the weary pragmatism of a field doctor diagnosing a disease. "That you came here looking for any man who would have you. And you've sunk your hooks into my nephew because he was the first one to look your way." Joanna's hands stilled over the shirt she was mending. A predator. The word was ugly, vicious. It stripped away all the quiet dignity of her feelings for Colt, all the slow, earned trust, and replaced it with a desperate, grasping caricature. It made her feel ashamed of the very hope she had just begun to nurture. The gossip had another, equally sharp edge, this one aimed at Colt. "And they're saying he's a grifter," Agnes continued, her voice laced with contempt. "That he's only being kind to you to get on my good side. That he means to take this house, this land, when I'm gone. This one hurt Joanna even more deeply. It twisted Colt's quiet, selfless acts of kindness, the chopped wood, the mended step, the warm bread, into a cynical, calculated plot. It was a vile stain on his character, and it was her presence, her association with him, that had put it there. Yet, as the outline of her life dictated, Joanna did not react. She absorbed the poison and held it within herself. She continued her work, her stitches as neat and precise as ever. She continued her quiet routine, fetching water, helping Agnes, and finding solace in the silent company of the whispering pines. She built a wall of stoic dignity around herself, a fortress the town's malice could not breach. But inside that fortress, she was beginning to feel the profound, aching loneliness of the besieged. Colt was not a man to build a fortress. He was a man who tore down walls. He heard the whispers, too, in the way men fell silent when he entered the livery, in the sly, sideways glances he received at the blacksmiths. For a few days, he said nothing, his face an unreadable mask of calm. He watched, he listened, and he measured. Then, one evening, the whispers found a voice. He was in the saloon, the dusty spur, having a quiet drink of water at the end of a long day. It was the town's central nervous system, the place where rumors were born, embellished, and sent out into the world. A group of ranchers, emboldened by drink, were talking loudly at a nearby table, their voices, full of cheap bravado, carried easily through the smoky room. Can't imagine what he sees in her. One of them, a man named Henderson, slurred, tall as a beanpole and a voice like a bullfrog. A man wants something soft to come home to. Not that. Another man laughed. It ain't her he's after. It's the old lady's property, playing the long game. Maddox is... Colt didn't move. He just sat there, his back to them, slowly finishing his water. His stillness was more unnerving than any sudden movement would have been. Henderson, mistaking the silence for weakness, pressed on, his voice rising to perform for the room. I just think it ain't right. A woman like that, putting on airs, making a spectacle of herself at the dance. A decent woman would know her place. That was the line, the invocation of a woman's honor, used as a weapon against her. Colt set his glass down on the bar with a soft, deliberate click. He pushed his chair back, the sound of its legs scraping on the floorboards silencing the entire room. He rose to his full, formidable height and turned to face them. He didn't look angry. His face was calm, his gray eyes as cold and clear as ice. He did not look at Henderson. He looked at every man in the room, his gaze moving slowly from one face to the next, holding each one for a beat, making them all complicit in the ugliness of the conversation. The silence in the saloon was absolute, thick and heavy with smoke and anticipation. I've been listening to you men talk, Colt said, his voice not loud, but a low, resonant baritone that cut through the silence like a razor. You talk about honor, about what's decent. You hide your cheap curiosity behind those words. He took a step toward the center of the room, his eyes finally landing on Henderson, who visibly shrank under the weight of his gaze. The woman you're all so comfortable whispering about, Colt continued, his voice dropping even lower, forcing them to lean in. She has more character in her little finger than this entire room has combined, and the honor you're all pretending to have. He paused, letting the question hang in the air, a final, damning indictment. That woman stands taller than the honor you're using as an excuse to peer at her. He let the words settle, a stunning, unanswerable truth. He had not threatened them. He had not raised a hand. He had simply held up a mirror to their own petty, cruel natures, and the reflection was unbearable. He had shamed them, and they knew it. Without another word, he turned, walked to the door with his unhurried, steady stride, and stepped out into the night, leaving a room full of silent, deeply ashamed men in his wake. The news of it reached the cottage the next day, as all news did, Agnes recounted the story, told to her by a humbled and sober storekeeper, with a look of grim, profound satisfaction. Joanna listened, her hands still, her heart pounding a wild, triumphant rhythm against her ribs. Later that afternoon, Colt appeared at the woodpile. He didn't come to the house, didn't mention the saloon. He just began his work, the steady, rhythmic thud of his axe a familiar and comforting sound. Joanna came out and stood on the porch, watching him. He eventually paused, leaning on the axe handle to wipe his brow with his sleeve. He looked up and saw her. Their eyes met across the distance. There was no need for thanks. There was no need for words at all. In his steady gaze, she saw his unwavering loyalty, his fierce, quiet protection, and he, in her shining, grateful eyes, saw that she understood. The battle had been fought and won, and their silent, solitary partnership had been forged into something unbreakable. The quiet that had settled over Dry Creek after Colt's stand in the saloon was not a peace, but a truce. The town's gossip had been silenced by shame, but the underlying tensions remained, simmering just beneath the surface. It was a fire banked for the night, waiting for a strong wind to stir its embers back to life. That wind arrived in the form of a man named Silas Croft, and he brought with him the promise of the future, the railroad. He came not on horseback, but in a polished black buggy, an island of eastern sophistication in a sea of western dust. He was a man made of smooth surfaces, a tailored suit, a silver tongue, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He represented the Union Pacific, and he carried with him maps, contracts, and a glittering vision of progress. The railroad was pushing west, he explained at an impromptu town meeting, and it needed a path. More than that, it needed timber for ties, for bridges, for the very bones of its expansion. And the finest, most accessible stand of timber in the territory was the Aspen Ridge, the stretch of forested land that rose to the north of the town. Mr. Croft's proposal was simple and seductive. The railroad would buy the land, a tract technically held in common by the township, for a price that made the business owner's eyes gleam. He spoke of jobs, of a new station that would put Dry Creek on the map, of the prosperity that would flow into their pockets as reliably as the trains on the tracks, for men like the storekeeper and the blacksmith, who saw their futures in terms of cash flow and expansion. It was the answer to a prayer. But for others, the proposal was a death sentence. That evening, Colt came to the cottage. He brought with him not firewood, but a deep, troubled furrow in his brow. He and a few of the other ranchers' men whose families had been in this valley for generations had met with Croft. He talks about trees like they're just dollars standing in the ground, Colt said, his voice a low, angry rumble as he stood before the hearth. Agnes sat in her rocker, her knitting needles still, while Joanna listened from the shadows. That ridge is more than timber. It's the watershed. The snowpack on that ridge is what feeds the creek all summer. You clear-cut those trees, the spring melt will come down in a flood, and by August, the creek bed will be dry dust. Our cattle will have no water. It's our winter fuel, Agnes added, her voice sharp. Our building wood. It's the only thing that stands between us and the north wind in January. He doesn't care about that, Colt said. He sees a map, not a home. The town was cleaved in two. On one side were the merchants, dreaming of wealth and growth. On the other were the ranchers and homesteaders, who understood the fragile, hard-won balance of survival in this place. The arguments spilled out of the meeting hall and into the street, splitting friendships and families. The future of Dry Creek was being decided, and the two sides were speaking different languages. A few nights later, Colt returned. This time, he carried a roll of papers. He spread them out on Agnes's large quilting table, the lamplight falling on a slick, professionally drawn surveyor's map and several pages of dense, legal text. This is their official proposal, he said, his frustration palpable. He jabbed a finger at the map. It's wrong. They've drawn the property line a quarter mile south of the old survey markers. right through the summer grazing meadows. And these words. He scanned the contract, his expression grim. They're full of traps. Timber rights in perpetuity. Unrestricted access to all waterways. It's a snake oil salesman's contract. We know it's a bad deal, but we don't know how to fight it. We don't have their words. Joanna had been standing back, a silent observer. But as she looked at the papers, at Colt's honest, angry face, something inside her shifted. This was not a world of whispers and social slights. This was a world of facts, of lines on a map and clauses in a contract. This was a battle she understood. "May I?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. Colt looked at her, a question in his eyes. She stepped forward into the lamplight and reached for the documents. He pushed them toward her. For the next hour, a deep silence filled the cottage, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft rustle of paper as Joanna read her education. A gift from a father who had believed his daughter's mind was as worthy of cultivation as any son's, had long felt like another of her useless, oversized attributes. But now, it was a weapon. She read every line, her finger tracing the convoluted legal jargon. She saw the loopholes, the deliberately vague phrases, the way the contract gave everything to the railroad and took everything from the town. When she was finished, she looked up. "He's right," she said to Agnes. "This isn't a sale, it's a surrender." Then she looked at Colt. "Your map is wrong because you're using theirs. We need to make our own." The cottage became their headquarters. Night after night, they worked. Colt, with his intimate, bone-deep knowledge of the land, would describe a ridge, a game trail, a hidden spring. And Joanna, with her steady hand and her precise, methodical mind, would translate his knowledge into lines on paper. She drew a new map, one that showed not just property lines, but the life of the land itself, the watersheds, the ancient timber stands, the vital grazing meadows the railroad's map had conveniently erased. She drafted their counter-arguments, her pen flying across the page. She dismantled the railroad's contract clause by clause, replacing the deceptive language with clear, ironclad terms that protected the town's resources. A new kind of intimacy grew between them in the quiet, focused hours of their work. It was the intimacy of two minds working as one, a partnership built not on romance, but on a foundation of deep, mutual respect. He admired her sharp intellect, and she, his unwavering integrity. The town hearing was held in the same barn where they had danced. It was packed to the rafters, the air electric with tension. Mr. Croft spoke first, his voice smooth and confident, painting his vision of a prosperous, modern dry creek. He dismissed the rancher's concerns as sentimental, backward-thinking foolishness. Then Colt stood to speak. He didn't use fancy words. He spoke from the heart, about water and wood and the future of their children. His speech was powerful in its simple, honest truth. But when he finished, the railroad's lawyer stood up, a thin, hawk-faced man from Cheyenne, and began to pick Colt's arguments apart with a series of sharp, legalistic questions that left him floundering. The tide began to turn. The merchants looked smug, the ranchers defeated. It was then that Joanna stood up. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. She held her rolled-up map in one hand and a sheaf of papers in the other. She did not look at the crowd. She looked directly at the circuit judge who was presiding over the meeting. "Your Honor," she said, her voice a clear, steady alto that carried to every corner of the barn. "There are details on the company's proposal that are inaccurate. May I present them?" The judge, intrigued, nodded. "Proceed, Miss Hale." She walked to the front, her height no longer a source of shame but an emblem of authority. She unrolled her map on the table, its hand-drawn. Meticulous detail, a stark contrast to the railroad's sterile survey. The company's map omits the 3 primary springs that feed Dry Creek, all of which are located within the proposed timber tract, she began, her finger tracing a blue line. Their contract grants them unrestricted access to all waterways, which would give them legal control over our town's entire water supply. For 20 minutes, she spoke. She was not emotional. She was precise, logical, and irrefutable. She used the railroad's own legal language to expose the flaws and deceptions in their proposal. She had taken their weapon and turned it against them. Mr. Croft's confident smile faltered, replaced by a dark scowl. When she was finished, the hawk-faced lawyer was speechless. Croft, seeing his victory slipping away, rose to his feet, his face flushed with anger. He chose to attack the messenger, not the message. "Your Honor, this is an outrage," he boomed, pointing a finger at Joanna. "Who is this woman to be lecturing us? She is a newcomer, an outsider with no stake in this community, a woman of unusual proportions, telling men of business how to conduct their affairs." The ugly, personal insult hung in the hot, still air. It was the same attack she had endured her entire life, the same dismissal of her worth based on her physical form. The old shame, the old pain, rose in her throat. But as she stood there, she felt Colt's gaze on her, steady and strong. She looked not at Croft, but at the judge. And then she let her eyes sweep over the faces of the townspeople, the same people who had whispered about her, stared at her, and judged her. She took a slow breath, and when she spoke, her voice was not angry, but filled with a powerful, resonant calm. "Mr. Croft is right. I am an outsider," she said, her words dropping into the profound silence. "And this town has made it quite clear that I am deemed too large to be loved." A flicker of shame crossed the faces in the crowd. She met Colt's eyes for a heartbeat, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "But if that is so," she finished, her voice rising with a strength she never knew she possessed, "then I am also large enough to protect this land." The statement was a thunderclap. It was a declaration not of a victim, but of a champion. She had taken their greatest insult and forged it into a shield, into a statement of her own immense, undeniable worth. The barn, which had been filled with whispers of scorn, was now filled with a stunned, rumbling murmur of respect. Joanna Hale had found her voice, and with it, she had given the town of Dry Creek a fighting chance to save itself. The victory was not loud. It did not come with cheering in the streets or a parade down the dusty main road of Dry Creek. It was a quiet, seismic shift, a reordering of the town's very foundation. The railroad's proposal was not just defeated. It was rendered obsolete by the simple, irrefutable truth Joanna had laid bare. A new proposal would have to be drafted, one that respected the land and the lives of the people who depended on it. Silas Croft and his hawk-faced lawyer had packed their polished buggy and departed before the sun had fully set, their eastern arrogance no match for the bedrock integrity of the West. The town's reaction to Joanna was just as quiet, and just as profound. In the aftermath of the hearing, as people filed out of the barn, they had looked at her differently. The whispers had vanished, replaced by a stunned, grudging respect. The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Gable, had met her eye and given a short, sharp nod of acknowledgement. The blacksmith had touched the brim of his hat as she passed. They were small gestures, but they were the beginning of an acceptance that was earned, not given. She had not become one of them, but she had become essential to them. She had saved them from their own short-sighted greed, and in doing so, had carved out a place for herself that was defined not by her appearance, but by her character. Joanna awoke before dawn the next morning. The air in her small room was cold, but it was a clean, invigorating cold, not the damp, lonely chill she had grown so used to. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she had slept a deep and dreamless sleep, the sleep of the truly weary and the truly vindicated. She didn't feel the familiar urge to pull the covers over her head, to hide from a world that had always seemed too small and too critical for her. Instead, she rose, washed her face in the icy water from the basin, and dressed. her movements unhurried and filled with a new, quiet sense of purpose. She stepped out onto the porch as the first pale, golden light of dawn was spilling over the distant mountains, setting the frosty prairie grass alight. She drew in a deep breath. The air was so pure and sharp, it was like a physical tonic, cleansing the last vestiges of shame and doubt from her soul. She stood there, on the porch that had become her sanctuary, and she did not feel the need to wrap her arms around herself or pull a shawl tight against the cold. She stood tall, her shoulders back, simply because it was the way her body was meant to stand. And then she saw him. Colt was by the side of the cottage, his back to her, taking the logs he had split days before and stacking them in a neat, sturdy rick against the kitchen wall. He moved with his usual unhurried economy of motion, each movement deliberate and sure. He was not there to make a point or to be seen. He was simply there, performing a quiet, necessary task, weaving himself into the fabric of her morning, into the very structure of her home. The sight of him, solid and dependable in the new day's light, filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the rising sun. He must have sensed her presence. He placed the last log in his arms onto the pile, then turned. His face was calm in the soft light, his gray eyes clear and steady. He looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw not just the pride of the previous night, but something deeper, something quieter, a sense of homecoming. He didn't offer a grand congratulations. He didn't speak of the hearing or the town or the victory. He simply looked at the way the cold air turned her breath to mist and gave a slight nod. "Colder than usual this morning," he said. His voice was a low, familiar rumble that settled her heart. It was a simple observation about the weather, but in the quiet language they had built together, it was an opening, an invitation. It was his way of asking how she was, of acknowledging the new world they had woken up in. Joanna looked at this man who had defended her, trusted her, and stood by her, the man who had seen her, truly seen her, from the very first moment. The question that had been living in her heart since the night of the dance, since he had spoken that one impossible word, rose to her lips. It was a question that required all the courage she had just discovered she possessed. She took a step toward him, her boots making a soft sound on the wooden porch. "Is there anything else you want?" she asked, her voice soft, but carrying a universe of meaning. The question hung in the cold, still air between them. It was a direct echo of her question at the dance, but this time it was different. It was not a question of confusion, but of hope. It was her offering him a chance to retreat, to say that his defense of her had been a matter of principle, that their partnership was one of convenience, or it was her offering him everything. Colt didn't answer right away. He looked at the woodpile he had built, a solid testament to his care. He looked at the small, sturdy cottage that had become her refuge. Then his eyes returned to her, and they were filled with a gravity and a tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. He took a step away from the wall, closing half the distance between them. He stopped, leaving a space that only she could choose to cross. "To choose you every morning," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper, almost a vow. "If you'll let me." The words were the most beautiful poetry she had ever heard. They were not a promise of ease or a declaration of fleeting passion. They were a promise of steadfast, daily devotion, to choose you. An act of will, repeated every day, a conscious decision to stand by her side, not just when it was easy, but on all the cold, difficult mornings to come. It was the most honest, most profound declaration of love a man like him could ever make. If you'll let me. And with those 4 words, he gave her all the power, respecting her strength, her independence, her own right to choose. A slow, brilliant smile spread across Joanna's face, a smile so radiant it seemed to rival the rising sun. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy, a smile that had been waiting a lifetime to be set free. The last of the ice around her heart melted away, and the fortress she had lived in for so long dissolved into dust. She had found her home. Joanna smiled, and she never wore that coat again. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you and hear your thoughts. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and give it a little extra support by hitting the hype button. It helps this story reach more listeners just like you.